All right. Okay, good. Let's start. Welcome, everybody. This is a webinar hosted by the Labor Work Group and Socialist Party USA. It's on the Teamsters and their contract campaign coming up. There's a contract that's due ending July 31st, 2023. And the Teamsters are beginning to make moves and everything in a more militant fashion towards improving tremendously that contract. And we want to look at that. How does it affects labor generally, and look at it from a rank and file perspective. What's going on in rank and file, how the rank and file is very important from supporting that union, moving towards a contract, what organizing is going on. I'm chair of the Labor Work Group. We're part of the SP USA. We do labor policy, education. We do encourage union organizing, training, and all things, information on the labor movement in general. And we've been growing in the past year. Socialist Party has been around since this version of it, 1973. We were part of the old Socialist Party of America. As it fell apart in 1973, three parts, it split into Social Democrats, DSOC, and Socialist Party USA. So we see ourselves as connecting to the old party of Debs and look to Debsian socialism, a lot of us, as the main principles. So that's a rank and file perspective in itself. We're going to have two speakers, start with Joe Allen and then Howie Hawkins. And I'll give you a brief introduction to each. Joe Allen has worked for nearly a decade with UPS between Watertown and Chicago, Illinois street hub, Jefferson Street hubs. He works up till he became a full-time package driver in the Chicago Loop. He says he's worked in different sections of the freight and logistics with such major employers, APA Transport, Yellow Freight, and UPS. He's been a member of several different Teamster locals and a member of Teamsters for Democratic Union. He campaigned for Ron Carey's re-election in 1996 and Tom Leatham in the following two Teamster elections. Born and raised in Stoughton, Massachusetts, he's lived in Chicago for 2 decades. Son and nephew of a United States Marine. He's the author of The Last War the U.S. Lost and the People Wasn't Made to Burn, and also The Package King, a rank file history of UPS, which I very much recommend that people see that to get up to speed as to what it's about, hang on one sec. Let me share that resource so that people can see that. What the history of UPS has been, especially from the Teamster view and the rank and file view, including rank and file insurgencies, UPS surge, upsurge, I should say, to the more current events to the 1990s, 2000s. He's been a writer. He writes a variety of articles in Tempest magazine and Jacobin. So I recommend you seeing some of these articles that he writes. They're excellent on labor and socialist politics, among others. I'll switch to then introduce Howie Hawkins. He's known to many people as a Green Party organizer and candidate in many Green Party, very many Green Party positions. He's a socialist, however. He believes in self-organization, independent political action, international solidarity by the working class. Attended Dartmouth College, working construction in New England, helped organize a worker cooperative, specialized in energy efficiency and solar and wind installations, joined the Socialist Party in 1973. Yay, Howie. Co-founder of the Clamshell Alliance in '76. I remember that. Went to Clamshell Alliance meetings in Cambridge. Boy, they were long. One went from 6:30 at night to 3 in the morning. I didn't That's
I
what we
think there's
have.
one still going on, Bill, right now.
Yeah. When you have consensus, this is the problem. Anyway, really, it was that way, and like there was left like 4 or 5 people. Anyway, I forget the details of it. He moved to Syracuse in '91. This is on the South Side, involving many community issues and so on. He worked as a Teamster 2001 to 2017, unloading trucks at UPS. Now retired. It remains a supporter of TDU, Teamster for a Democratic Union, U.S. Labor Against the War, and Labor Campaign for Single Healthcare, among others. And a candidate for so many races. He helped keep the ballot status in New York, I think, by running governor. Was it, Howie?
Yeah, until this year, thanks to Andrew Cuomo and the Democrats, we got the hardest ballot access in the country now.
Right.
So I'm running write-in campaign.
Right. Pretty good. So we have 2 people with a lot of Teamster experience, and we want to see what's going on with the Teamsters now. We see the election of Sean O'Brien and Fred Zuckerman. Zuckerman is part of the TDU slate. And Sean and he are getting very militant in their rhetoric. The Teamsters just got a contract with Cisco Foods in Plimpton, Mass, and Syracuse, and had very militant actions. They brought Teamsters in at 1 and 2 o'clock in the morning, 400 of them to on the picket line, and trucks to block trucks going out. There was scabs going out. Cops came in, etc. There a few arrests, but in the end, they got a huge contract wage boost, among other things. They want to show, and Joe and Howie go in more detail, that they can be a winning union, go after bigger prey like Amazon, etc. So we'll start out with Joe, and again, welcome, Joe, and give us an overview. And you have about 15-20 minutes or so.
Well, I'll take about 15, just to get the ball rolling here. Thanks to friends and comrades at the Socialist Party for inviting me. I don't do a lot of webinars, partly because of my work schedule and so forth, but I'm glad to do this tonight with my old friend and comrade, Howie Hawkins. I think it's, to start with, we should just go through some of the basics about UPS. I mean, UPS is an enormously powerful, important corporation in the global economy. Globally, it employs, something like 534,000 people on an international scale, mostly in the United States and in Europe, but it's now a global company. It competes with other big logistics companies, like DHL and FedEx on a global scale, and still competes with, other major national post offices. In the United States, it employs over 440,000 people. Somewhere around 350,000 or so are members of the Teamsters Union, which makes UPS the largest private sector employer in the country. Something, to give people an idea of what that means, is a position that General Motors, for example, used to hold back in the 1950s through the 1970s, and no longer is that. So, and that means that UPS is not only has a big impact on the economy of the world, where it moves somewhere around 3% of the world economy each day, something like 6% of the US GDP, which is just enormous that one company does that, but it has an important impact on labor relations, the evolution of the modern logistics industry. UPS has been a pioneer in all of that. When it comes to the Teamsters Union, it is by far the largest single Teamster employer. There's nothing that comes even close to it. And in some sense, UPS is a union within a union in the Teamsters. When you go to compare it to any other, major employer, let me put it that way, just one company, right? Most trucking companies don't, the biggest ones like Yellow Freight don't really employ more than 25 or 30,000 Teamsters, and that's on the high end of a company like an old freight company like Yellow Freight. So, compared to 350,000 Teamsters, and again, it's a tenth the size. And of course, that's quite a change in what the Teamsters Union was really. I mean, a lot of people still have an image of the Teamsters, mostly a wrong image of the Teamsters, that it's still something, dominated by gangsterism and is predominantly called a trucking union. At one time, the basis of the Teamsters, during the Hoffa, the first era, was among freight drivers and over the road freight drivers. But the deregulation of the trucking industry and the collapse of the Teamsters in that industry during the course of the 1980s and 90s, with the corresponding rise of UPS, has meant that these situations have really kind of flipped themselves. So in the old kind of trucking and freight industry, the Teamsters is fairly marginal and UPS is quite big. That also makes it something of an anomaly in the logistics industry, which tends to be overwhelmingly non-union. The unionized sector of the logistics industry, which I think we can all, come to understand is really at the heart of the global economy now, is only in small areas is unionized. It's overwhelmingly non-union. So, what happens at UPS between, what UPS does is its plans as a major corporation on a global, national level of the United States plays a major role in shaping the logistics industry. The relations between the Teamsters and UPS shapes really all sorts of things when it comes to wages and working conditions across the United States. So, for example, UPS, which was, a fairly large company by the late 1960s, 1970s, was referred to in the media as a quiet giant because it did no advertising. It was a business-to-business operation. But it pioneered much of, the worst aspects of the revolution in workplace relations, really since the 1970s. So the proliferation of part-time work, of contingent work, the incredible pace of work that takes place, much of this was pioneered by United Parcel Service. While at the same time, UPS did spend a lot of time kind of trying to create this, in the 80s and 90s, this benign image of itself as a good corporate citizen and makes a lot of donations and relates to the United Way and things like that. So you have the image and the reality. And this image and reality really kind of came into a clash in 1997 when, under the leadership of Ron Carey, who was the first democratically elected, rank and file elected Teamster leader, you had the first national strike in the UPS's history. And it was a historic strike, not just simply because it was the first strike at UPS, but it kind of took place at a moment when the union movement was really quite flat in its back. Nobody really knew what its direction was. And the 97 strike not only ended up being a hands down victory for the Teamsters, it raised the possibility of kind of a real turning point in the direction of the entire labor movement, which quickly came to an end following the UPS strike when the federal government, both the Clinton Justice Department and the congressional Republicans, carried out a witch hunt that ultimately drove Carey from the union. And those are the circumstances that brought Hoffa Jr. into power for 20 years and where the union has gone on a consistent retreat on all fronts under his leadership. We saw last year an election in which many former Hoffa people finally broke, most notably Sean O'Brien, who had a very notorious reputation in the Teamsters, is not just a Hoffa loyalist, but quite a thuggish character, broke with Hoffa, promised a new direction in the union, and won a 2-to-1 victory over Hoffa's appointed successor, a man named Steve Verma. And since then, we have seen, a lot of raising expectations at UPS. And this is a good thing. I mean, that, after 20 years of retreat and a kind of predictability to, what the union was prepared to do, that is, not only was it prepared to negotiate concessions after concessions to a company that just was fabulously profitable year in and year out, and including the pandemic, which I think has sharpened all these issues quite a lot, but was also prepared in a very undemocratic way to impose contracts that were voted down by the members. So it's a breath of fresh air, the election. It's a breath of fresh air that there's a talk of a national strike next year, but we should be very clear, no one's voted to strike anything yet. I think that, hopefully over the next 6 and 8 months, we'll see some of the rhetoric of militancy and the rhetoric of striking, that the actual organizing for a strike catches up with some of the rhetoric. Because I think that, we've seen, over the last year and a half, a kind of a return to American workers striking again, particularly in the industrial core of the economy, a kind of uptick in organizing in very specific areas of the economy. And if you had a company like UPS, which actually went out on strike and was prepared to fight to win over very legitimate issues at UPS, at a fabulously profitable corporation, that it creates the potential for an even wider and deeper class struggle and revival of the labor movement in this country. And I think we would all look forward to that. And hopefully that would also propel forward organizing in the big non-union logistics company, most notably Amazon. But, frankly, we shouldn't leave FedEx out of these discussions, or many of the big trucking companies that have grown up over the last 20 or 30 years, who are vital parts of the economy, who don't really get some of the recognition that they should, who also need to be organized. So I think there's quite a lot at stake. I think UPS is the perfect place to fight these out, because UPS really can't make an argument that it's not making money, it's on the edge of bankruptcy, concessions are needed. This just isn't what UPS is. It hasn't been, it never has been. Right? I can't think of a year that UPS ever lost money. And if we can win these battles, we can help turn the whole labor movement around. And why don't I just stop there, and we'll turn it over to Howie.
Thanks, Joe.
Okay, Joe, thank you. Good to be with you again. I would emphasize, just to begin, my remarks, that the UPS contract affects a section of the working class with a lot of power and leverage in the economy, just due to their central place in the logistics industry, and getting products to consumers and to businesses. And Joe gave you some of the figures about how big a company this is. If UPS goes on strike, if the Teamsters go on strike, the whole economy is going to be affected. It'll be crippled. And that's where I think, that's where socialists want to be, in terms of working with workers and having leverage over things. In 97, UPS cried uncle in 2 weeks, because they were rapidly losing customers to FedEx and DHL and the post office. And they had a great slogan, and they won over the community. Part-time America doesn't work, if I remember correctly. And that, a lot of people could relate to. So they were in solidarity with UPS, not mad at the workers for going out. And I worked at UPS for 18 years, and I came in shortly after the 97 contract was adopted after that strike. And all the good things I had in my contracts after that came out of that strike, because the Hoffman administration, which, took over from Kerry, given, seems like federal intervention to get rid of Kerry, that strike, was, the Clinton administration didn't like it. After that, every contract was concessionary. And my hub would always vote it down. And then in the most recent contract, which I think was 2018, when I was finishing up working at UPS, the majority of Teamsters around the country voted it down, but there was a clause in the Teamster Constitution that, in the interest of the union or something, unless 2/3 voted it down, the administration could, shove it down our throats. And they shoved it down the throats, particularly of what's called Worldport in Louisville, where, depending on what reports you read, anywhere from 11,000 to 20,000 workers are in that hub. It's where all the small packages go. It's in the center of the country. It's within 2 hours of most of the country by air. And they voted it down. And they also voted down their supplemental, and it was by overwhelming numbers, because that's a hell of a place to work. So many people. There was recently written up a pregnant woman committed suicide in a bathroom there after she was fired. And that's just an indication of the kind of stress those people are under at Worldport. But all of us, and all the hubs. I think it's a good sign that the Teamsters got rid of that clause requiring a 2/3 vote, enabling the top leadership to approve contracts that the members voted down. I think it's also a good sign, and just in terms of influence in this sector of the economy, you know, you have the Amazon Labor Union by itself organizing union elections, winning one in Staten Island. They organized 6 walkouts on Prime Day last month. The Teamsters are also focused on Amazon, and even my former local, which I could tell you a lot of stories. I mean, I'd often get ruled out of order for going to meetings and proposing that we take this or that action. You know, they basically wanted to operate the union like an insurance company. I mean, that's the way a lot of workers look at it. You pay your dues and you get some benefits, and that's all there is. And the members aren't informed about things like organizing at the big Amazon hub they're building around here. Now the union's talking about supporting that. And, you know, I'm looking forward to see if they actually do that. So where we are now is the Teamsters did organize some informational leafleting the first week of August to let the workers know in 1 year the contract expires July 31st. This fall, they've got a membership survey going on about what they want for contract proposals or contract proposal meetings going on, and where they can get it going, you know, member actions, parking lot rallies, and so forth. So, you know, the rank and file, you know, the union itself is helping the rank and file get organized, although it really depends on the local, you know, on whether they follow through on those kind of activities. And the rest of the, you know, national Teamsters plan is to, well, the national bargaining begins in the spring, and there'll be member actions like parking lot rallies and trying to inform the members in the spring and summer. And July 31st is when there's either a contract agreement or a strike. And somewhere in there, there'll probably be a strike authorization vote, which I think, you know, the rank and file will vote for it, because that just sends a message to UPS, you know, you should give us a good contract. And as Joe pointed out, it's a very profitable company, 11 billion in profits last year, that there's plenty of surplus to share with the workers. And, you know, I'm still in touch with some of my former workers, really among my closest people. The last one retired in August. But, you know, the big issues are part-time versus full-time. That's always been a big issue at UPS. And then they got a 2-tier system also for new drivers, package drivers versus old package drivers. And that's a sore point. And another big sore point is forced overtime, including, you know, required 6-day work weeks, particularly for package drivers. Another problem is, you know, just contract things like supervisors working. So, and I think, and actually I've seen, you know, some Teamsters raising this. I mean, it's an opportunity to raise eco-socialist demands for electric vehicles and powering the hubs with renewable solar and wind sources. And actually, we've seen the postal workers, you know, actually as a union put this forward against the Trump appointed postmaster. His name is DeJoy, although the postal workers I know, and I've done a little postal work, they call him No Joy. He's, you know, he wants to buy a bunch of fossil fuel trucks, you know, in the next 10-year plan. So, you know, this is an opportunity to raise all kinds of demands that would also win support in the community. So, you know, maybe some people listening want to, you know, really get involved. You can, it's a good time right now if you want to work at UPS. I mean, for me, it was a lifelong ambition. And back in the 70s, it was $10 an hour to start, which is like $40 an hour today. Part-time, I could have lived on that and not had to work construction, which I ended up doing. By the time I finally got in, it was $8 an hour to start because of the concessionary contracts that they started agreeing to in the 70s and 80s until that 97 contract. But even the 97 contract didn't get the starting wage even back to where it had been in the 1970s. But, you know, in peak season is the time to get in, although post-COVID and given the, you know, relatively high employment rates, it's a lot easier to get in than it used to be. And, you know, the good thing is you get usually good healthcare benefits, although you often have to work, depending on the local supplemental, you know, work several months or even a year to get qualified for that benefit. But if you get it, it's very good. but you got to realize it's kind of a boot camp atmosphere. I mean, I'm a former Marine. It wasn't quite as intense as that, but it was similar. You know, you got supervisors screaming at you, and it's physically challenging, particularly if you work in the hub, handling packages, unloading trucks, loading trucks. Most of the work is done at night. Your snot is going to be black because of all the dust, you know, when you get off work. Common injuries are to the back and the carpal tunnel issue with your wrists, even concussions. I mean, I've seen a number of people, these walls in the trucks, if you're unloading, they'll fall on people. And, you know, some of those packages are heavy. One of the changes they made before I got there was maximum weight went from 75 to 150 pounds. And I'm telling you, they accept weight a lot heavier than that. I mean, we weighed one engine on a pallet one time. It was 375 pounds once they weighed it, but they didn't leave it in the truck and send it back where it's supposed to come from. They made us lift that onto the belt. So that's just being forewarned. But if you get involved, you want to get involved in this struggle, that's the way you'll be closest to it. If you're in the community, get to know your local Teamsters. They're UPS package drivers all over the place. I mean, you can ask them, like Joe was talking about. And I think the last thing I'll say is a good place to find out what's going on is the Teamsters for a Democratic Union website. And TDU just had their 47th convention. They had 450 people. It was the most people they've had since the 97 contract fight. The UPS contract, they had a whole summit around that. They had people from other parts of the labor movement. Sarah Nelson, for example, was head of the flight attendants union, has been on TV a lot. You may know her. And the website just has great information on it. You can read current contracts. It's probably easier to read it there than get it from your local, if it's like my local. They got a tool you can compare how the supplementals to the contracts that deal with local issues compare from place to place. And it has discussion of the issues at stake in this upcoming contract. So that's a good source to keep informed as this thing develops. And I'll stop there, and I'm looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Howie. If anybody has any questions, put them out in chat and I'll pass them on. I have a few questions too. TDU comes out of a tradition where they were very organized in the 70s, 60s, 70s, especially going forward, in different industries. They had caucuses that were somewhat strong. They made some impact, especially, Minders for Democracy, TDU, the Teamsters, a few others. How organized is TDU today? Are there any caucuses going around in the major hubs or whatever, socialists and otherwise?
You want to start on that, Joe? I know you've written them.
Start with Joe, then Howie.
Well, I think, well, first of all, TDU should, they should always speak for themselves. So I think maybe in the future you can have a TDU on to talk about what they're doing and how they're organized. You're going to get something secondhand from me. I think there's a couple of things about, let's put it this way, if we pull back the lens a little bit, on this discussion, is that, it's been during certain periods of time, the Teamsters, which, during most of its history was a very conservative union. And during a far too long a time was one controlled by organized crime. That isn't true anymore and hasn't really been true since the late 1980s, when the consent decree with the federal government really kind of broke the mob's control over the union. And so, you look at the 1930s, most famously in Minneapolis, where the Minneapolis Trotskyists, led by the Dunn brothers and Farrell Dobbs, pioneered really kind of industrial unionism in the Teamsters and the Teamster leadership under Dan Tobin, another Irish American from Boston, who leading the union, was opposed to it. But on the other hand, you can't deny success when it's successful. And they organized Minneapolis, and then they organized over the road drivers. And in many ways, even though they were driven from the union by a combination of both the federal government and the Teamster leadership in the early 1940s, the model that they pioneered, really became the model for building the Teamsters Union on the eve of the Second World War, and then really after it, particularly identified with Hoffa Sr. The next time that the left becomes an influence in the Teamsters Union is in the 1970s, first and foremost because there was a rebellion of rank and file Teamsters. I mean, there was, what was going on in the Teamsters, particularly in the upper Midwest, but not exclusively there, provided an opening for radicals and socialists to participate with that, generation of rank and file militants. Probably the best known was Pete Camrata. To build a presence during the mid and late 1970s, first around contract issues with Teamsters for a Democratic Contract, and then formally with a group called, what came out of it was Teamsters for a Democratic Union. But in the late 1970s, two things happened. In the late 70s, early 80s. One, the rank and file movements in all industries collapsed, and the left disintegrated. One of the few places where rank and file organizing continued was in the Teamsters, partly because, one, there was a cadre of people who were prepared to carry it through, but also because the Teamsters was a particularly authoritarian union. So there was a need for a corresponding organization to fight that. And the big opening really for reformers in the union is when the federal government threatened to put the whole union under trusteeship, and TDU campaigned, rightly so, for the right of a rank and file vote for top officers, for convention delegates, and so forth, which led to the election of Ron Carey, who was one of the few really not just clean, uncorrupt leaders of the Teamsters, but also quite a militant leader himself. And of course, even though UPS was even at that time, and certainly today, the largest Teamster employer, Ron Carey is still the only leader of the Teamsters who comes out of UPS. So, I think those were the two big periods where the left, had big openings provided for it. The last couple of years, I think, you've seen TDU, which, like many, or reform groups throughout the labor movement, had a lot of thin years to it. And they made the decision to support Sean O'Brien for president of the union. I personally disagree with that kind of idea, but nonetheless, it helped give an image of O'Brien that, one, he had to deal with reformers in the union, and it gave some credibility to kind of opening up the questions that have been sat on for well over 20 years about the direction of the union. I think right now, there's a possibility of many thousands of rank and file Teamsters, whether they're UPS or not, to actually play a role in reshaping the union over the next few years, which really has not existed since the early mid 1990s. And so I think we look forward to that process, and what comes out of that process may be one, a rejuvenated TDU, or maybe even new organizations of rank and file Teamsters. I think we'll see, but certainly the events at UPS over the next year will be something of a turning point for all those questions.
Well, what I know mostly about TDU is having been a member and using them as a resource, and also when contracts came up or officer elections at the national level came up, they were the most organized group trying to challenge the Hoffa administration. And so I've found it to be a useful resource. What I've read about, the Teamsters that came together to form TDU in the 1970s, I mean, they were heroes in a way, because they were physically challenged by the gangsters that were running, the Teamsters at that time. And it was, it was taking some risk to stick your neck out and challenge that system. One of the things about the Teamsters that I think enabled the reform movement to get roots in some places is that the Teamsters the locals have a lot of autonomy. The national can't impose as much control over them like they can in some other unions. So, the reform movement was able to get, some local bases, and I think that sustained them through the leaner years. And is also remains the fact that you get involved in the Teamsters at this point, and depending on your local, you could have a lot of influence. So the other thing I'll say is, yeah, the TDU got behind Zuckerman the previous election, and this time O'Brien with Zuckerman is running for the general secretary. Both of those guys, I mean, Hoffa basically pushed them away. Zuckerman was head of the big union in Louisville, the World Port. And, that contract was shoved down his throat. That was the end of it for him. And similarly, in that contract negotiation, O'Brien was raising things, and I think they kicked him off the contract negotiating committee. So, then TDU had to make a tactical decision. Do we support these guys who really aren't totally with us? But I do know I was at the convention where Zuckerman, gave a talk before he ran, and he said, I can't believe I'm at TDU because I used to fight you guys. But now, given what Hoffa's done, we should work together. So I guess the lesson there is, keep bridges open to everybody, because you never know when you're going to end up on the same side.
Okay, we have a question from Will Neville. It's in, can you guys read that? You and Joe, Howie, can you read that question? It's a long one. Will worked in part-time in UPS with a lot of stress.
It seems like Will is expressing concerns about what seems to be a kind of macho culture among some UPS drivers. Is that what, Howard, is that how you're reading it also?
I'm just nodding because, that is part of the culture.
Mm-hmm.
Also
Right.
in the hub.
Well, I think that's capturing a real thing. I think, first of all, I think we got to remember that, excuse me, that, UPS, it depends where you are, and it's uneven. I mean, because as you become a bigger company, it's harder to create the kind of cult-like, atmosphere that used to certainly exist throughout UPS. And what I mean by that is a kind of, you bleed brown, which is a very strange kind of term. But they spend a lot of time on head fixing people and creating a culture of, which, one of their past CEOs used to refer to as a combination of the Marine Corps and the Quakers. And, I was a Marine. My mom and uncle were Marines, and the Marine Corps and the Quakers don't really have anything in common. But the whole idea was this idea of quiet obedience, I think, and accepting a kind of, you live to work rather than work to live. And I think that that's still far too much of the time, does exist in places, and does exist certainly among a section of workers. And all it really leads to is contributing to, an atmosphere of, people getting injured, not reporting their injuries, and things like that. Part of being in a union is the idea that, one, you negotiate conditions that are good for everyone, and that everybody is both responsible for enforcing these things. And but too much of the time you still find this kind of atmosphere of the job is what the job is, and it's kind of like, well, you go to work. You don't go to work to get injured. You don't go to work to be treated badly, and so forth. And I used to work with a guy who I considered a friend, and I loved working with him. I won't say his name because I just, he passed away. Is that, he was an ex-Marine, had a little bit of a macho culture, and a few years after we stopped working together, he was transferred out of Jefferson Hub and working out at the big facility out in the suburbs here. He died from heat exhaustion. And, many of his coworkers said that, the company played on his, just work it through, just push it through to the end. And well, pushing it through to the end was probably a big contributing factor to him dying on the job. I think there's less and less of that sort of culture at UPS, partly because one of the things about climate change and the predictable summer heat crisis is that we know that it kills people. We know that it kills UPSers, and we know that it makes people ill. So, I think that this is an opportunity provided by this stuff to, one, negotiate around putting air conditionings in the truck, which they don't have, negotiate putting air conditioning in the hubs where they don't have them. They have them in management offices and in computer centers, but not for human beings. And it also means taking on some of this macho culture, which is not just simply backward, but it contributes to an anti-union atmosphere that's isn't one of solidarity between the workers. I mean, Howie, what do you think about that?
Well, getting to the end of his question, he's asking what specifically are UPS Teamsters looking for in the next contract. I think you hit on some of the top things. He asked about wages and benefits. Of course, that is certainly one of the things they want. There's 2 tiers between part-time and full-time, getting paid different amounts for the same work. Same thing with part-time package drivers and full-time package drivers, which came into the most recent contract. They want to get rid of those. Forced overtime, working 6 days a week, or 14 hours, even if you don't want to, if you're a package driver, those are big issues. And then getting to the culture. I mean, supervisors are like not just sergeants, but drill instructors in boot camp in a way. They're abusive. People want respect. They also don't want the supervisors doing Teamster work, which they sometimes do, and they got a loophole in the contract when you're shorthanded. Well, why are we shorthanded? Hire more people. And the heat issue is huge.
Right.
We did have UPS Teamsters die of heat exhaustion this summer. And as Joe said, we don't have air conditioning or even fans in the hubs. Down south they do. I know Louisville does because one of the Syracuse workers worked there for a while. But he said it blows the dust around. He almost didn't want it. And also the heat. I mean, I got frostbite on the end of one of my toes during a polar vortex, several years ago. And I was, we were dealing with rail cars, steel bottom and just sucking the heat right out. And the hub, it was keeping that temperature inside the hub as opposed to being in the trucks on the dock or the rail cars, like 55, 60. So it was below zero when you get out into that truck or rail car. So, those are issues as well. Just health and safety issues, I think, are also what, the Teamsters want to deal with. So, wages and benefits, not having forced overtime or double, pay tiers, and then respect, including not just from the people supervising, but from the, by providing, adequate cooling or heating in the wintertime.
Okay, Dennis Fritz, Teamsters Local 705 in Chicago has a question. Given the pace of delivery, especially that Amazon have trained U.S. consumers to expect, bring it to the door, etc., it creates a brutal pace for work that makes UPS so profitable. It's and good for UPS customers. Might UPS successfully appeal to its customers to maintain the status quo? I'm not sure how you mean that, but Amazon raises the bar of delivery and customer service, delivery, but this is brutal for workers, the pace, the logistics, as I mentioned, algorithms at one point that just surveils you and whatever. That's a brutal pace.
Well, what I think he's getting at, Bill, is the whole idea that we have this one-click consumer culture, which is certainly true. I mean, you can't deny it. I mean, we all buy things from Amazon or other major retailers, and many people have come to expect same day or next day delivery, and that's partly also how they compete against one another. right? I mean, that's what the big logistics companies. And I think there's two sides to that. I think the point that Dennis raises is absolutely true, is that as we've moved towards, this type of instant delivery almost, right? Same day delivery, same hour delivery, that sort of stuff. It means the working conditions are correspondingly worse for people. Absolutely true. And I think consumers, now remember, consumers are all different sorts of people. We're consumers, there's, CEOs that are consumers, right? But I think a lot of those people also kind of, they have two minds about that. They want the convenience, but they don't want it at the expense of the livelihood and health of other people. I think that's, some of that played out in an interesting way in '97, because one of the miscalculations of UPS, let me put it this way, was they thought the company was more popular than the delivery driver. And what they learned is that the delivery driver was, in the eyes of most of the customers, the company. And they liked their driver, And so if you had, a person who you spent time with when he was doing his deliveries or his pickups, and he was able to explain to you what the issues were, that made a big difference. Now, having deliveries that, like, 1 hour, 2 hour deliveries, same day, next day delivery, all that sort of stuff, is that for Amazon drivers, it's a much more difficult affair getting to know some of them. But I still think with UPS drivers, there is that type of connection that exists with the customer base, and it's certainly something I think the union, like it did in '97, should do over the next, it's harder to do during Christmas rush. That's certainly true, as Howie knows, working Christmas rushes. But maybe after January, that's certainly, that type of connection between the customer base and the drivers is certainly going to be, I would think, a major part of the union's strategy for building support for the contract fight.
I'm going to let Eric Chester, a lot of talk here. Eric, let's see. Here you are. Hold on. Can you unmute yourself, Eric?
Now can you hear me?
Okay, you come in very loud, so back off of it. This sometimes happens with your stuff.
Yeah, I wanted to pick up on one of the things that Joe said, because I found it really interesting. Just one point about Cisco. If you really look at that contract, it's not a very good contract. It's got a 39% pay increase over 5 years. You figure it out. They'll be lucky to keep up with inflation. It's not very good. And they didn't win on any other things as well. So I guess part of my question is, I'm afraid, and I'd like to get Howie's and Joe's response on it, that Cisco's telling us what's going to happen. That is, come the UPS, at the end of the contract, there'll be a show of force. There'll be a day or two of militancy. Then O'Brien will go into the back room and make a deal, because, Biden's going to be on his ass. And it'll be similar to the Cisco thing, which looks 39%, but you figure it over 5 years, it ain't so great. And that's it. There won't be anything about part-timers, air conditioning, let alone respect, because Howie, that sounds easy, but you're really looking at the essence of capitalism. They don't respect workers. That's the way corporations are. They disrespect their workers. So to really win that would take quite a lot. So that's what worries me. And Joe mentioned the possibility of a new rank and file caucus coming out, and I was wondering whether that's a real possibility or not, because it seems to me that currently TDU is no longer a rank and file caucus. It is part of the administration. It is part of the O'Brien administration. That's not rank and file caucus. Those are two contradictory things. So I wonder if there's a place now for a new kind of Teamster caucus that would actually ride herd on the O'Brien administration.
Okay, thanks, Eric. Okay, who would like to answer that?
Howard, do you want to start and I'll jump in?
Yeah, I think it really depends on what happens between now and July 31st. If there is preparation for a strike, and the national can help with this and the locals have to be prepared. So they know logistically what they got to do. They know what it's going to cost them in terms of lost pay, even though there's a big strike fund that's been building up for 20 years. So they're prepared. That'll make a lot of difference. So whether UPS can force, or win from O'Brien, a concession that the workers say, okay, let's take it because we got to get back to work, or whether they're willing to hold out a little longer. So a lot will depend on between what happens now and July 31st. I don't see TDU as part of the administration. I see them as still trying to organize rank and file. And I have heard, but I'm not a worker there anymore, so maybe I'm out of touch. I haven't heard of any initiative to form a new caucus as opposed to TDU. I think an indication they have support is the size of their convention this year.
Another question from Jose, comparing the lead up to the 97 contract and then strike, what are some of the similarities and contrasts to this upcoming contract?
Well, let me jump in on answering a little bit of both.
Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Last questions is that, well,
Yeah.
first of all, I would just say to Eric, I don't think the future is written that way. I think it's more unpredictable. And I think if we learn from like the last year and a half of what's been going on in the labor movement, which in some ways was foreshadowed by events in the Teamsters over the last decade, is that the pandemic really sharpened a lot of the growing anger among not just working class Americans in general, but particularly among industrial workers and their conditions. And what you saw was that given the opportunity, workers not only vote down bad contracts, but they repeatedly vote down contracts and are willing to go out on strike. And I think that same spirit certainly does seem to exist within the Teamsters. I think there's a couple of things about the Cisco strike that I think is important, is that, well, first of all, Cisco workers should speak for themselves, first of all. But my reading of some of it from the outside is that I think we saw some of the biggest mass pickets in a long time. And if that shows some, in this one corner of the Teamsters Union where you saw what took place in Plimpton, begins to spread a bit. I'm not saying becomes a model, but begins to be spread a bit. We're reintroducing a tool of mass struggle that we really haven't seen since the 1970s, and maybe even before that. And so those are important, I think, important developments. I think when it comes to, the relationship of O'Brien to and others to the Biden administration, those are of real concerns. Remember with the rail negotiations is that they first welcomed the intervention of the Presidential Emergency Board, which was a mistake. They endorsed the settlement, which was a mistake. And of course, it's been voted down by the Maintenance of Way Union, which is affiliated with the Teamsters and is currently being voted on by the Brotherhood of Locomotive Engineers and Trainmen, who are also Teamster affiliated. So we'll see how the outcome of that vote is. But I think if part of the equation in the minds of the top leadership of the union is that their alliance with the Democrats will help them with the contract at UPS and other places, I think we should say to them that that's really not the direction that they should go in. Now, I think when you go back to, the contract campaign that led up to the strike, in some sense, there's some similarities between then and now. There was a Democratic president then, Bill Clinton. There's a Democratic president now. The labor movement then was much more in a difficult situation. We've seen some, the atmosphere around the labor movement change a bit. While at the same time, everybody feels a kind of nervousness about the economy and the future of the labor movement. I don't think we should romanticize the contract campaign that led up to the strike, but we should learn from the best of it, which is, and the best of it was bringing in, regular drivers, regular hub workers into a mass campaign to take on UPS, which had not been done before in the history of the Teamsters. And if there's one thing to take into, the fight, particularly next year after the union begins, I think that's, an example of what should be done. And that may have to just be fought for by the members too. I mean, most of the Teamsters union, let's remember this, 2/3 of the members don't work at UPS. Most unions don't have UPS members. And most UPS, local unions, Teamster local unions, are still largely in the hands of some fairly conservative people. So, it's going to take a lot of rank and file education and activism and to not only fight for a contract campaign, but ultimately to fight for to vote for a strike and to vote in favor or not in favor of whatever tentative settlement may be agreed upon. But I really don't want to run ahead of the story here, because I don't think the story, as the way that Eric laid it out, we're not seeing theater here. Everybody's playing a part and we know the end. I don't think we know the end yet. I'm more optimistic.
Matt Cavagrotti mentions that just look at the recent agreement between mechanics and pilots with UPS. That's what you'll get. So I don't know if the contract was a bad contract.
Well, certainly the contracts so far this year haven't been great. I mean, the airline mechanics got a pretty minuscule pay increase. But, we haven't heard them speak out on it. It passed, but it was concerning. The deal at Costco was very confusing. It didn't seem to be all that good. Initially the union recommended that they were going to be neutral on it, which means most of them didn't like it. And then it was sort of heralded as this kind of big victory. So I'm very confused about what the position of the Teamsters is on it. And the rail negotiations are concerning, because it appears that, there's too much of a reliance on thinking that Joe Biden and his Labor Secretary, Marty Walsh, are going to be on the side of the workers. And I don't think the tentative agreement at all in rail shows that to be true. So these are real concerns. And, I highlighted some of that in my most recent article in Tempest on that. And at the same time, we should say that what we've seen over the last decade at UPS is larger and larger numbers of UPS workers, UPS Teamsters, are just not prepared to tolerate the status quo anymore. They want change, and they want it now.
Howie, you have anything to say more about that? Or
Well, I would just note that the big issue for the rail workers was scheduling, forced overtime.
Right.
It's a big issue at UPS too. And, I think, the Teamsters are going to push for, rank and file are going to push for changes to that, because they want their lives back. You make a pretty good amount of money given the qualifications, but it takes all your time, particularly the package drivers. So I think that's a big issue. And like it was with the rail workers, I think the package drivers in particular are going to push for more reasonable hours.
Matt asked another question about rank and file strategy, labor bureaucracy and Democratic Party. Bill and Howie, what's unique about SPUSA's relationship to that strategy in contrast to someone like, say, DSA? Speaking for the SP generally, well, we don't have an official viewpoint, but I like what I read in the rank and file strategy. I've always have, that it takes a real organized rank and file that maybe in caucuses, et cetera, that pushes and moves, just as TDU did in early years. And you still need to have that. Socialists need to push for that. Otherwise, you have, again, like in the rail, you have that Democrats that high up, giving you a bad deal. So yeah, we've always distanced ourselves from DSOC and DSA. I'm not sure what DSA, I hear about rank and file, they support that type of strategy. Well, maybe it's a lot of factions in DSA, but I think overall the SPUSA does support that kind of rank and file, and we'd like to study that more what Kim Mooney has to say, and including recent articles about that. And having been a member of IWW as well, I get a lot of, I'm informed by that, but I'm not an syndicalist in that sense. In the Boston local, I'm always arguing with Steve Kellerman about this. You know, you're a damn Bakuninist, you know. So, well, I'm a Debsian socialist. And he's, what's a Debsian socialist? Well, Debs was for the rank and file, based on that same principle that Marx said, that the workers themselves have to emancipate themselves from capitalism. That's what Debs is saying as well. So we hold firm to that. Now, how do you put that into practice? How do you, deal with that? Will Zuckerman help the rank and file on this, or whatever? I'm kind of skeptical about contracts that you have a big contract, a lot of money, and it's a business union. According to the Teamsters, you have social unionism, business unionism, class struggle unionism, or industrial unionism, and so on. Different types, but it's still a business unionism. So give them a lot of money, and they'll keep, burning you to death, and keep you on the thumb of the logistical algorithms. So I think rank and file have to be involved. What do you think, Howie or Joe? I mean, well, you said something about that, Joe, but Howie.
Well, I'm a member of the Socialist Party USA. I joined it when it reformed after the split of the old Socialist Party of America over the Vietnam War and independent political action. And that was, very important to me. So, I think our strategy generally is we don't rely on the Democratic Party like most of the labor bureaucracy does. And our independent power as workers organizing, speaking for ourselves, instead of letting other people speak for us, or being in coalition with a party run and funded by capitalists like the Democratic Party, is the better approach. And, I think bringing that into, say, the contract fight, that's the kind of conversation you have after you've built relationships with people around the immediate issue of the contract. And then, sitting around having a cup of coffee or something, you can begin to talk about the larger political issues. As far as DSA goes, I think they're all over the place because they're a large organization and don't seem very coherent to me. The national committees will make pronouncements and the rank and file will grumble. National committee or the convention at their last convention sort of oriented more and more toward supporting Democratic candidates. But last night I had a Zoom call with DSA members around New York about my little writing campaign for governor, because they don't like the Democratic candidate and want to see what we're talking about. So I would say DSA is an open book, I guess, or, the chapters are yet to be written, and we should work with those folks. Although personally, going back to DSOC days and the Vietnam War, I haven't joined. It's just kind of, how could I? But I do work with DSA people when it's possible.
Well, I'm, as a fairly traditional Marxist, I believe, my starting point for any type of working class struggle is the belief in self-emancipation of the working class. I think that's the heart of any type of trade union strategy. It's the heart of any type of political strategy, and that's what informs how I view, these questions. But I'm also, and to some degree, I think that the rank and file strategy, as it's been articulated by different people, is something I think most closely is aligned with those politics. But, I'm also someone who's, has learned over the last few years that discussions of grand strategy I find to be a bit ethereal sometimes. And I guess I'm much more for talking about where not only socialists who want to be active in a union like the Teamsters or any other union is to really discuss, more practical day-to-day, workplace issues, getting involved and educating yourself and, working with and learning from and educating the people around you. Because I think the first thing we should say, particularly about UPS Teamsters, is that they've done a very good job at voting down contracts and getting rid of an old and conciliatory leadership. The question is, what do we want to bring to, what do we as socialists, broadly speaking, want to bring to a situation like that? And I think we want to bring a lot of different things. But I also think we need to learn from our co-workers and long-standing activists in the union. And so I'm I'm a little less for talking about grand strategy, which doesn't mean I'm against talking about politics. I think we should be talking about politics, about the Democrats, about the nature of trade union leadership, the particularly unique problems with the Teamsters union, which has lost over 300,000 members during the last decade. Let's not pretend we're not dealing with a union that has some serious institutional crises to it. I think we should be talking about socialist politics all the time, but what does that mean practically on a day-to-day basis? I mean, if you get a driving job at UPS, or if you're working in a hub, the time to actually talk about politics and to be a union activist is fairly limited and episodic. So I think, I'm for more practical, immediate discussions. And, I think coming out of that will create the kind of networks that you need within, some of the massive hubs, that exist at UPS. I mean, there are small hubs and regional hubs, but, for the most part, you're working in buildings that employ hundreds, if not thousands of people. And as Howie knows from his experience, and I know from mine, you're only interacting with small groups of people for a few hours a day. And, on staggered shifts where you may not interact with lots of people at all, who are all in the same union. So I think that, I lean towards the day-to-day and the more practical discussions. And from there, you can build the type of stuff that would be necessary for an effective contract campaign on your shift, and maybe even begin to change your local union. So that's where I lean on those things right now.
Yeah, just to put that maybe a little more concretely, the way not to do it as a socialist is show up with your newspaper or your leaflet, when the shift changes, and hand it out and expect people to take you seriously. If you're in the workplace, I mean, I found over the years, and I'm dealing with upstate New York. This is Trump country. So the white boys coming in from the farms, and then I'm in the city with the highest child poverty and family poverty rate of any city over 100,000 in the country, Syracuse, New York. So we're dealing with very different kinds of people, plus a lot of immigrants from Iraq and the Congo and Sudan and Cuba and Dominican Republic. But, when we have our little 10-minute breaks, politics comes up a lot. And being a political person, people that are not following politics would often ask me what I think. I mean, there's a lot of opportunity, to talk about politics from a socialist perspective. And, I just one example, I was working with this Cuban guy. He had a Che tattoo on his arm, but he had left Cuba. And I said, why? You want to make a better living? He said, I wanted freedom. And he was thinking about taking his tattoo off, but basically he liked the idea of democratic socialism. He just didn't see it in Cuba. That's just one conversation I had. And another one, another guy, former Marine, same age as me, a Baptist, a black guy who was socially conservative, but as we talk, he sort of came out like a social democrat or New Deal liberal on economic issues. And we would unload trucks together and we'd be shouting at each other. The supervisors were afraid of us, unlike, usual case, because he was a big guy and, I had a big voice, and they just leave us alone because the more matter we got, the faster we unloaded. So, but we were good friends, it was an argument. So what I'm saying is it's important to build relationships so people then can hear you presenting your views as a person, not just, somebody handing you a leaflet or a newspaper that they don't even know. So, Joe is right. Most of the time you're working, but there are, meal breaks and, breaks in between. There's in the contract, they can't work us for more than 3 hours without a break. They often do, and we often win those grievances and get a little extra money. But there is an opportunity to speak. It's not like a big webinar, but it's real, and it happens. You can have those conversations.
Another question is, again, okay, well, I think I heard Sean O'Brien said it at some rally somewhere in the past several months. We're going to reach out to community or church groups, et cetera, et cetera. Are they reaching out to community allies for this contract for this contract campaign support, especially if it's a strike. Also, he wants a position, get a good contract position to make the union, the contract strong, make the Teamsters very strong, and go after the Amazon. He has a division now in the Teamsters of wanting to organize the Amazon warehouses, et cetera. He's been staying with Chris Smalls, et cetera, et cetera. What do you know about those two things? Will there be community allies reached out? That's untypical for a lot of unions. It's always in-house. But if it comes down to a massive strike and you have scabs and strike breakers, some places you need all the help you can get. Howie and then Joe, maybe, or who's ready to speak?
Well, I think UPS, those package drivers, as Joe was describing, a lot of people like their package drivers. A lot of times they like their mail carriers or letter carriers. So you have natural outreach and you can build those community relationships. And also in a lot of communities, the UPS, everybody knows somebody working at UPS, or at least in, working class neighborhoods. So I think there are plenty of opportunities to build community support. That's key though. It was a big part of '97. Part-time America doesn't work. Boy, people related to that. We need a good slogan again.
Well, I think that all those things are possible. I mean, if there's a build-up for a strike and a strike of 340,000 workers in the biggest logistics company in the United States, it's going to have a big impact, as it did in '97 when half that number worked at UPS. I think there's probably still a lot of work to do to build the contract campaign at UPS itself. I mean, people should keep in mind a couple of things. I mean, one of the things is there's an enormous turnover rate among part-timers. Sometimes people have even worked many times at UPS over the years. In some ways, on an annual basis, it's almost 90% of part-timers come and go. That's a weakness to try to organize around. In the big logistics hubs, Worldport in Louisville or any of the major metropolitan hubs that exist throughout the United States. Most of the part-timers are there for a very short period of time and are gone, which is why, the strength of the strikes tends to be around the package car drivers, the feeder drivers, and the airline pilots, because if they don't work, nothing gets delivered or moved, right? And so that's really, where the core of this organizing will be, because it also has to be there. I think there's a couple of things about Amazon that people should, I just think, that are worth just kind of people keeping in mind. Is that one is that I think it's good that the Teamsters have raised this as an issue. Last year at the Teamster convention, a big resolution was passed creating an Amazon division with an Amazon director and a framework for organizing. We haven't seen much organizing though. I think part of the problem is the Teamsters said that they wanted to organize specifically the drivers, unless they've changed their mind on that. But, at a place like Amazon, there's something like 1,000 to 2,000 separate companies that provide drivers to Amazon workers. So that's a really tough terrain to try to organize, workers on the basis of. When did the Teamsters last organize anything remotely like that? Well, they haven't. Which is also a reason why you have to have a very big win at UPS to kind of show people this is a union that can take on a company like that. I'm a bit more skeptical of organizing at Amazon unless it's organizing done by Amazon workers. I think the one victory of the ALU, I wish they had more, does show you that when Amazon workers are organizing Amazon workers is a better likely breakthrough than not. So I think that, one of the things about the future of organizing at Amazon is that the Teamsters, I think, need to really figure out how to put Amazon workers, not just at the center of, these small actions that they've been involved in, but actually in the top-down leadership of any organizing campaign on a national or regional basis, because that's the only way that I even think they can even seriously get something going. but when you go back to UPS, you have to say, one of the things about UPS and how it's shaped the Teamsters is that, this is a company that it has grown astronomically really over the last, 20 years, 20, 30 years, and in some sense softened the collapse of the Teamsters in the freight industry. But that, growth of UPS as a union within a union didn't require mass strikes or mass organizing. The union grew with the company, which means that in most places you have a fairly complacent trade union leadership. They've never had to organize anybody at UPS. They're very narrowly, see themselves as contract administrators. So, that's the way that both the nature of UPS and its growth has shaped the Teamsters, and that impacts how the Teamsters view organizing people. So, none of which is good. And so I think that, even if you have an important victory at UPS, it doesn't necessarily translate into an organizing model for the Teamsters at Amazon. At least that's some of the stuff that I've been trying to think through a little bit. It's not going to be a union that comes from the outside. It has to come from the inside.
Howie, do you have anything you want to say on that?
Not on that, but I think, going back to contract issues, one I forgot about is the surveillance that, package drivers and everybody is under now with all these cameras. And, it's kind of stupid. The artificial intelligence or the algorithms they're not as smart as people. So package drivers, they're told how they're supposed to deliver in what order. And they know us, like I worked at UPS. UPS driver knows, I got to bed at 6 in the morning. I'm not going to be up at 10 a.m. to get the package that he can't leave on my step, not in my neighborhood. So it goes back to the hub. But the route says he's got to stop by, and ring the doorbell. That's irritating. And in Syracuse, the infrastructure is so old from the mid 1800s. Some of it's wood, I'm talking about sewer mains and water mains. And we have an average of a road collapsing into the sewer or water main every day. So the route that they're being told to take, they can't because the road's blocked off. So they take a detour, and when they get back to the hub, they're chewed out for not following what the computer told them to do. That's a source of major irritation for package drivers. So that surveillance and not letting drivers use their common sense is an issue as well. So I just wanted to bring that up before I had forgot about that, but that's one thing I'm hearing.
Well, that's a big question. I think, how do you deal with that and how to counter that? And maybe it's rank and file opposition in all kinds of ways. And is that something to be brought up in collective bargaining? I don't know. That's a big question.
Well, these are disciplinary issues that have to be dealt with because there's just far too much harassment of drivers. Look, the thing that is really frustrating, is that we shouldn't fear technological development. It should make work safer, easier, a place you want to go to. Instead, technology is used to increase exploitation and harassment and supervision. And so, on one hand, you need language in a contract that protects you from this unfair surveillance and harassment. You also need to have the right to strike. And in far too many places, the right to strike may exist, but it's such a convoluted process. It rarely, if ever, happens over local grievances. That needs to come back. But I also think that there's a kind of approach that the American labor movement has had for so long, which is, we let the company control the conditions in exchange for higher wages and benefits. And, I think we have reached something of a point where part of this has been building for a long time. And it's grown, I think been sharpened by the pandemic, which turned many industrial workplaces into centers where people, got very ill or died or brought illnesses home to their families, or they brought illnesses from their families into their workplaces, where people want to have more control over their workplace. And that's partly what the whole debate about remote work is, right? Because if you're in a situation where you can work remotely, then you feel like you've won back anywhere from 3 to 5 hours of your life a day. Now, if you're a package car driver, you can't work remotely, right? Or a hub worker or a feeder driver. So there needs to be the type of fight over limiting overtime or making it voluntary without disciplinary consequences for the workers. Now, that's a tough battle, because not only does that mean taking on the company, it means taking on a whole approach to workplace negotiations that is deeply embedded in the entire, labor movement, with few exceptions.
Right. Well, they say AI, philosophically, there's good AI, there's evil AI. And in the hands of UPS and Amazon, I guess we got evil AI, and that's what's happening. Well, the humans speaking back, and that has to be through power and unions. We're going to wrap up here. I think we've gone on an hour and a half almost. And thank you very much. Look for our future webinar on the UAW and rank and file run for president of UAW and the UAW problems there. And thank you to Howie, Hawkins, and Joe Allen.
Well, thank you, Bill. Thanks for inviting me.
Sure. And thank you for your, read at Joe's articles and Howie's as well on various issues, including UPS. And we shall see you on the picket lines maybe by next July.
Right.
I don't know, provided we get that good contract. That's the thing. Look closely. It's going to be one of those 50-50 deals in a murky gray area, I don't know. So thank you all for coming here tonight, and watch and support the Teamsters so they go, as we move on towards contract time, and as it's starting right now. Take care. Good night, everybody.
Good night, everybody.
Good night.